Friends of Radio Bria, welcome back to our live shows. Tonight, me and the crew, Luke, Anto, and Ichigo, are here to assist Beppe in the third appointment we have with Many Paths, One Road. Appointment is the correct word? I don't know. Tonight we are very, very, very excited and honored to have Ordway from the United States of America as a guest here tonight. It's the first guest from over the ocean for us, so we are very, very, very happy about that. And what to say more? Well, I should say two words in Italian maybe for the Italian audience. Benvenuti a tutti amici di Radio Brea. Questa è Radio Brea, ovviamente la conoscete, la web radio di Sentieri Tolkieniani. Questa sera, dicevo prima in inglese, io, Liu, Canto e Ichi, che possono anche salutare, tra l'altro, li vedo ancora lì con i microfoni muti, ma possono dire qualcosa? No, non dicono.
Io dopo. A tutti, che bella puntata stasera che si prospetta.
Bravi. Questa sera appunto siamo qui per supportare Beppe in questo progetto che è Many Paths One Road, che è appunto questa collaborazione fra The Tree of Tales e tantissimi altri soggetti decisamente importanti del mondo accademico tolkieniano mondiale, con noi poveri sfigati in realtà di Radio Brea e Sentieri Tolkieniani, con noi poveracci, per appunto supportare Beppe e portare avanti questo progetto. Questa sera c'è appunto come ospite Ordway dagli Stati Uniti d'America. Noi siamo molto 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 felici e orgogliosi di questo ospite che è per noi il primo da oltreoceano. Ma direi basta ciance, perché sennò, come sapete, io mi dilungo anche per delle mezz'ore e lascio la parola a Beppe.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to our Italian audience. Welcome to our English audience. Gilby already said that we are very honored to have Holly Ordway tonight. I'm very grateful to her. I know her work. We've almost managed to meet a few times, but that's the first time we actually meet in person. At least how much it is possible under the current circumstances. Holly is a fellow at the World on Fire Institute, which is a wonderful project. The people who don't know it, Google it, World on Fire. You will find out what it is. It's one of the most important, I think, projects which has been going on in the past few years in the States. She's also a visiting professor at the University of Houston Baptist University. She is the author of 2 books. Actually, I should say 3, because there is a 3rd book which she has just finished to publish, which is, of course, on Tolkien. The full title is Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. I like the word beyond. Tolkien sometimes is kind of restricting into some sort of bubbles, which can be either the bubbles of the people of fantasy or the Christian bubble or the people who perhaps love medieval stuff. Holly is helping us to go beyond. And in a way, what we are going to do with that tonight is also something a bit similar. We are going beyond prejudices, we are going beyond biases, and we're going to focus on a very important character of the Lord of the Rings, which is quite often forgotten, or sometimes she's perhaps emphasizing contrast with other characters. But in fact, Éowyn, who is our character tonight, he's playing a very important part, just like all the other characters. Tonight we are looking at her not in reaction to anything else, not to say that Tolkien was also a feminist, whatever. We are looking at Éowyn because she is just part of the mosaic, and we don't want to forget anyone in our path, in our journey this year. As always, as you already saw last time, we have a format. We have prepared a few questions in total. First of all, I'm going to start to ask the first 2. Then Ichigo and Luke will join me. But then, as we did last time, we'll open the floor to the audience who are following us on the various channels of Sentieri Tolkieniani and Radio Brea. So I already said that please do start writing down the questions, and Gilby will be collecting them. And then after the first half an hour of the conversation, we'll open the floor. We really like to have a nice dialogue with Holly. We are going to finish by 10 o'clock. We are quite sharp, but as happened last time, if there are any questions left, we'll collect them and we'll address them in due course. We don't want to finish tonight. I mean, it's a journey with different steps. Tonight is one step, but it's, as always in Tolkien, it's a never-ending journey. So I will start. Thank you very much, Holly. I will start with the first question, and I couldn't start then with one of the most heroic scenes of Éowyn, which is when Éowyn faces, of course, the Nazgul, the king, the witch king of Arwen, and she cries to him, "But no living man am I." You will remember this very beautiful scene. And this cry that she is not a living man somehow encapsulates, epitomizes a key aspect, of course, of the personality, of the nature of Éowyn, of her characterization, which is, of course, her gender. She is a woman, and she stresses that very, very clearly. So the first question for you, Holly, is what do you think is the role of a feminine identity as regards both the characterization, the development of her character, but also as regards the role that she's playing in the general narrative, in the general story, starting from that very episode. Thank you very much, and I leave you the floor to you. Thank you very much again.
Oh, thank you. And this is just great fun to be on this international program. And I liked what you were saying about the sort of mosaic and making sure we get all the pieces and not taking any one of them kind of out of context. Because I do think you're right. This has happened a lot with Éowyn. And I think even that one scene that we're starting with has gotten sort of taken out of context. I am no man, I am a woman, and therefore, this is the pivotal moment. And I think, it's a fantastic scene. It's just such a great and powerful reversal where, the Witch King doesn't expect this. He's caught by surprise and defeated, and it's coming about because of who she is as a woman. So in a sense, it's a very powerful affirmation of her femininity. But I think what is most interesting about this is the way that it's part of this larger, longer journey that she's taken, because it's not the climax really. It's a piece in that journey, because we have to go back and see where where she starts off. Because when we first meet her, she's in the hall, she's sort of in a way in the shadows, and she's very, struggling. She's frankly depressed and anxious about her role, and doesn't feel that she has anything valuable to contribute. And then it's a course of despair. She falls in love with Aragorn. I will come back to that later, but she falls in love with Aragorn, and she's rebuffed very gently but firmly. And so she kind of goes downward, and then it's out of an act of almost despair that she confronts the Witch King. And then sort of we build up again after that, where she has her healing and her recognition that she's got something to live for. And I think that her role of her femininity or feminine identity in that is really so important, because why is she despairing in the first place is, I think, a really interesting question. And it goes back to Wormtongue, who is, we all know that Wormtongue's working on Theoden and, getting him, trapped in this idea of I'm old, I'm weak, I can't do anything. We see that. But I think it's easy to overlook the fact that Wormtongue has also been dripping his poison into Éowyn's ears. You're trapped, you're stuck here, it's worthless, you'll never accomplish anything, you're just a woman. And so Wormtongue is feeding her a negative interpretation of her feminine identity that she's buying into. She accepts it. She's poisoned by it, the same way that Theoden is, until Gandalf, gets him out of it. And I think this is a really important thing to realize, because that's a lie that she was not important and not cared for, and it's a lie that Wormtongue is doing because he wants to possess her. We find that he's trying to work a deal with Saruman that he'll be given Éowyn after the fall of the House of Rohan. So we see, in a way, all the negative manipulative elements, all the worst aspects of male possessiveness operating on Éowyn. And then we see her breaking out of that and eventually coming in the House of Healing to a fuller sort of acceptance of her genuine feminine identity, the wholeness of it. And I think that's a really important arc in terms of just affirming this whole idea of a feminine identity. And one of the things I love about it is that in the process, Tolkien manages to say yes to all of the positive aspects of Éowyn's character, because in the end, he affirms her desire to be a healer, no longer a warrior. But he also affirms the fact that she's a tough fighter. You know, she takes down the Witch King, and that's pivotal for the battle. And she's honored for that. And so he manages to take her on this journey of her feminine identity that affirms both the sort of what we might call the characteristically feminine, but also the masculine elements, you know, that any woman can also have, the fierce fighter as well as the nurturer. So I think she's just a fascinating character in that arc of her feminine identity.
Wonderful. Oops. Wonderful, Holly. Thank you very much. I mean, it's I was also taken aback by what you said, because it's very tempting in a way to focus on the detail. And thank you very much. It's so important to remember that in Tolkien, everything is historical. I mean, there is not a single moment in the history which in a way is more important than the others. And thank you very much. And the second question will kind of move away a bit, you know, just from the character of Éowyn. So in a sense, it's complementing what you already said. It's not just a matter of putting Éowyn within his historical context, but also Éowyn in relation with other characters. And the first two characters I would like to ask you, put you in relation with, are the other two main female characters of the Lord of the Rings, so Galadriel and Arwen, who are, of course, elves. And in a sense, all the three characters play a very important role, different way. And in order to develop and understand better what is the role played by Éowyn, I will ask you, what do you think are the similarities between Éowyn and the other two characters, and what are the differences? In what sense it's her uniqueness, in a sense? And the other quite interesting thing, which is something which in this particular series we are very interested in, is how does the fact that she's a human being, that she belongs to the race of mortal men, affect her personality? What does he add? What's the kind of link between her characterization and similar in comparison and in contrast with other characters?
Yeah, I mean, you've managed to hit on some of my favorite characters in the book as well, excepting Sam. I think Sam is my favorite. I think maybe he's everyone's favorite. But if we leave apart Sam, and then we have Éowyn, and then we have Galadriel, it's just such powerful characters. And again, such powerful female characters. So I would say that one of the things I see in common amongst all of them is that we have female characters who are very strong in themselves. They're not just strong in relation to the men in their lives, but they're strong in themselves. And I think, again, this is so important because somehow I'm not quite sure how this has happened, a lot of different factors, but people tend to assume that somehow Tolkien didn't understand women, didn't like women, which is historically very strange because he was married, he had a daughter, he had a granddaughter, he spent lots of time with them. And unlike, for instance, many of his other colleagues in Oxford, he had many female students. And many that he even mentored, Simone Dardenne. He helped some of his women students at Leeds get work at the Oxford English Dictionary. He had many colleagues in the English faculty. So he in fact knew lots of women professionally, as family friends, as family. So it ought not to be a surprise that we've got strong female characters in The Lord of the Rings, yet somehow people tend to be sort of surprised by that sometimes, which is very strange. But we have Éowyn, who's just a very powerful, strong character. I mean, she has her own views, her own ideas. They're not always good ones, because she's a rounded character. She's not a cardboard cutout of a female hero. She's got her flaws. And then we look at Arwen, who's mostly off stage, in the story of the Lord of the Rings, but in the larger legendarium, we find that Tolkien gave her a really important, significant role. And certainly we see her impact indirectly in the motivation of Aragorn, through the Lord of the Rings. And then Galadriel, again, another strong female character. She's basically in charge in Lothlorien. And I think it's interesting, you think of her, but you don't think of Celeborn. You see, actually they're both there, but he's actually the one who's pushed into the background. He's kind of nobody really in the scene. It's all Galadriel who is really in charge, setting the tone, relating with all of the characters in her own very particular way. And we get that hint of her backstory in her temptation and resistance to the temptation of the ring. So again, in the larger legendarium, she's got this really important role. So I think the first thing I would note about these three characters would be the way that in quite different ways and roles, Tolkien has created three very powerful individual female characters who have a profound effect on the lives of the people around them, whether it's indirectly, like with Arwen, whether it's by actually being in charge, as Galadriel is, or whether it's by simply striking out and doing what she feels needs to be done with Éowyn. We've actually got these really strong women who, they've got their ideas of what they should do and they do them. So I think that to me is kind of the similarity. Now the difference, partly, I touched on it already, the way that they engage in different ways. But I think what you said about the fact that we have elves and Éowyn's a human brings up another really interesting point here, because Tolkien once said that the whole theme of the Lord of the Rings is death and the desire for deathlessness, and that I think gives us a really interesting contrast, because as elves, Galadriel and Arwen, as long as she's an elf, they're deathless. They're in the world until it comes to an end. The conditional immortality of the elves. And Éowyn's a human, so death is the gift that has been given to her as part of what it means to be human. And so I think it's kind of thematically interesting that the character, like the woman, the female character who ends up being so important in bringing down this deathless witch king, is the human woman who has particularly the limited lifespan, that she has the gift of mortality. And I just think thematically, that's just a rich vein. And I doubt it's coincidental.
Sorry, I know I'm changing my plan now because we are planning to have a third question, but I must ask this question because for me that's so interesting. So thank you for pointing that out. Can I ask you to develop even further what you were just saying? Because another interesting thing about Éowyn and about that particular scene that we started with is that she is rushing into the battle. She has rushed into the battle with a cry of death. And it's quite clear that in that particular context, death and despair are quite connected, because there is also Éomer who starts crying death and death, death at the moment of despair. But as we know, also from the ending of The Lord of the Rings and also from the general secondary theology of Tolkien, death is not something to be afraid of. It's not something to be considered as the last moment of despair, but it's actually the gift of Ilúvatar. So I don't know, I would like to know your thoughts about this strange combination of a mortal woman who is killing immortal, sort of immortal witch king in a moment in which she has been looking for death as the outcome of her despair, and to add a final piece into the mosaic, but while a moment in which she's trying to save her uncle, because she faces the Witch King not out of despair in that particular moment, but she faces it to save. She doesn't really know whether he's dead or not, but to going to the rescue. How do you? What's your idea about this strange combination, this strange mix between death and immortality, and the different outlooks on these two things?
Well, it's a fascinating question, and I think it's interesting to step back a little bit and look at all the different threads. I mean, you've already noticed that Éomer, he's crying death, death when he thinks that she's dead. But think also, of Theoden, who's now fallen. Éowyn thinks that he's dead at that, or might be dead at that moment. And look at the arc that he has taken, because when he's under Wormtongue's spell, he's viewing death as something that, it's inevitable, and it's something to be kind of declined into. He's going to crumble and old, and he's worthless, and eventually he'll fade away. And then he comes out of that, and when we see him, leading the ride to the rescue of Gondor, he's aware that he's probably going to die in this. It's a pretty high probability, but he's going to his, at least, likely death, not despairingly. He's not throwing his life away. He's actually going to try and use it well. If he lives, great. But if he dies, he dies. He's giving his life in the cause of defending, his allies, and defeating the armies of Sauron. So we see here, kind of this, it's really like a theological point, that we have this gift of life that we can't hold on to with clenched hands, because then it's no longer a gift at all. And death is not something to be feared if we kind of take it, not lightly in the sense of trivially, but sort of sitting lightly to it. And so, we have Theoden then, who has gone into this battle, aware that death may come, in contrast to Éowyn, who has gone into this battle with the wrong attitude. She really does go into it despairing, which is the wrong way to go into it. And then again, shift the focus a little bit. In Gondor, you have Denethor, who is fallen to despair. And you have there a father-son, where he's about to take Faramir with him into death, because he can't bear the thought of losing control, and facing a life that is no longer, in the way he exactly wants it. So there again, you have despair and the wrong attitude towards death. I'm going to seize death at the moment that I want it, to make my life round out exactly the way that I want, and take Faramir with me. So we have kind of almost these sets of attitudes. And when you look at Éowyn then facing the Witch King, you see her kind of shifting away from despair into a more positive frame, because she could have just charged into the battle and gotten herself killed, at the nearest orc. She could have basically committed suicide by battle, but she doesn't. I think when she comes to the point, she's not actually fully gripped by despair. She sees something worth fighting for. She's fighting for. She's not just throwing her life away. And I think you're really right in bringing in the fact that she's right there, with her foster father, and it maybe calls her back to her right self to say that she's willing to sacrifice her life, but not throw it away. And that, I think, is really maybe one of the turning points for her character, that death becomes something to accept if it comes, but not to seek out of despair.
I have to say, it's very moving in many respects. Also, I was noticing before that in all cases, at a certain point, there is a step where the character moves away from thinking about himself or herself, about what she wants or what he wants, and what is outside himself and outside herself, and someone who is other than him or her to save it. It's the same thing that happens to Merry in the very same scene. He's very afraid, he's just a hobbit, but then he looks at Éowyn, and then he becomes truly himself and becomes very brave. So there is this very beautiful dynamics by which one really truly becomes himself or herself when stops thinking about what she already wants and moves to save someone else. This is very, very Tolkienian. The one becomes himself or herself, truly who he is or she is, when gives the life away, which of course recalls the words of someone else. But at this point, I will stop here, and I will forgive us for changing a bit the plan, but this is what happens with Tolkien, that you go deeper and deeper and deeper, and there is never an end. So you will go on forever and ever. But please, Luca, I think it's you now, or Anto.
I start. So you talk about Galadriel, Éowyn, and Éowyn. What kind of Eowyn is Éowyn? Who are the literary model? What in sense is similar of her literary predecessor? How it is different from them? So I stop it.
Well, this is I love this question because I've really had a new idea about this since doing my research for my book that's coming out, Tolkien's Modern Reading, because we can, I think, recognize pretty readily some aspects of Éowyn as, the Valkyrie character, the woman warrior, but she doesn't quite fit that precisely for a lot of reasons. And one of the things that I discovered when I was looking at what Tolkien read of modern literature is that Éowyn really has some very clear-cut predecessors in two books that Tolkien himself names and acknowledges as very important for his writing. And those are two books by William Morris, The House of the Wolfings and The Roots of the Mountains. And we know that he read them because he says so. And we know that they were deeply influential on The Lord of the Rings because he says so in his letters. And one of the things that I found when I was actually going back and reading these books, because it's one thing to know that Tolkien acknowledges having read or been influenced by a book, but a lot of people stop there and they don't actually go back and read the book, which is what I did for the things that I tracked down. And I found in each of these books, there's kind of a prototype in a sense of Éowyn in each of them in different ways. And it's fascinating to see how Tolkien changes them. So in The House of the Wolfings, we get a character, actually get a father-daughter pair. The House of the Wolfings is a sort of historical fantasy, and you have the people of the Mark, who are actually the Gauls, who are fighting off the Romans, who are the bad guys. And we have Theodulf and his foster daughter, Halsan, and she's actually his actual daughter, but she doesn't know it. She's being raised as his foster daughter. And Theodulf, like Theoden, falls under an influence from magic, in this case, a magical chain-link vest, to weaken his will and sap his energy. And also Halsan goes from being, just the daughter of the house to being a warrior. So while her father and his forces are away fighting the frontline battles against the Romans, she's back at home. And there's a scene in which she spontaneously decides to gather together all the old men and boys and the women of the house and sort of make a last-ditch defense of the hall against the Romans. And she's acknowledged as like, oh, this is great. So you're leading us well. So we have an image here of, the daughter of the house who then steps up and becomes the defender of it, much like Éowyn is tapped to stay behind and lead, the people into the mountains while the armies go off to Helm's Deep. But it's interesting to know what Tolkien does differently, because in Morris's story, Halsan just sort of thinks of this herself and, assembles, kind of ragtag bunch, and they don't really do much of anything. And they're not, it's just sort of impromptu behind the scenes thing. Well, very nice, but not that big of a deal. And what Tolkien does is he makes this official. So we have Éowyn, who is acclaimed, Hama, who's, one of the key figures of Theoden's household, says, well, all love her. She can be our leader. And then Theoden explicitly gives her the authority in his stead, just as if she were his son, to keep guard over his people while he's away. And so Tolkien actually heightens her importance in the story by this. And the other interesting character that is a sort of a literary grandmother is in the other book, The Roots of the Mountains, which is again a sort of a historical romance, a bit more fantasy-ish. And in this story, we have with the most ridiculous names of characters. I have to say, Morris was not always very good with character names. So we have this woman who is known only as the Bride. That's it. That's her name. She's the Bride. And she's engaged to be married to another character, this young man called, I kid you not, Face of God. But Face of God jilts her and goes off and, does his own thing. And the bride, who's still called the bride, even though she's been jilted, she becomes despairing, and she explicitly rejects the woman's role and goes out to battle very much with that Éowyn kind of attitude of, I'm just going to die in battle because it's a waste of time being a woman. And she goes off and she's wounded. And when she's recovering, another character, Folkmite, who has loved her, he basically helps her to get her motivation back to live. And she ends up marrying Folkmite and live happily ever after. So we have kind of a parallel to Éowyn going into battle, becoming wounded, and then falling in love with Faramir, etc. So we have again that, and there's a speech that the bride gives that's very evocative. I think in a way, I think it's probably an influence on Éowyn's speech to Aragorn, where she says, what's the point of this? I want to go fight and die. But again, what does Tolkien do with this material? He complexifies Éowyn's character. He makes it so there's more going on thematically than just the reaction to being, jilted, apart from the fact that Aragorn is a much better character than Face of God in the story. But also, he makes Éowyn's role much more significant, because in Morris's The Route to the Mountains, we have the bride going out to battle and being wounded, but she doesn't have any particular effect on the outcome of the battle. It's just something that happens to her. It's not pivotal. It's really no big deal. Whereas Éowyn, effectively, she turns the tide of the battle, we could say, by taking out the Witch King. So again, Tolkien has raised the value of his female character. He's taken in, I think, some influences from Morris as a source. They're quite powerful characters in Morris's books, but he's made them more complex. He's made Éowyn more three-dimensional. He's made her role more important, and he's honored her contributions more. So he's frankly strengthened her as a woman character, as well as, making the role of her story more interesting. And so I find that Éowyn ends up being a really interesting figure when we look at the way that Tolkien drew on his modern reading. And he draws on these things, but he doesn't ever just take them in undigested. He's always transforming. He's always reshaping. And we know that Morris was such a powerful influence on him from his, earliest days, really. He says so. And yet, even that powerful influence, he doesn't just take it in wholesale. He's assimilating, he's adapting. And in this case, I think he's showing quite a powerful regard for women in making Éowyn much more interesting and more important than in these other, I think, sources.
Wonderful. Now we have a question from Ante, but just a comment on this, because this is so important. I want to highlight it. You remember that Lewis used to say, you cannot influence Tolkien, and Tolkien cannot be influenced. And there are so many people who talk about influences in the wrong way you were just describing, Holly. So I'm so grateful that you managed to pinpoint it in a sense, because in Tolkien is such a great, if you want, esteem of himself as a literary writer, that he's completely free to say what he wants, in a sense, to appropriate whatever he wants, all the ingredients that he wants, but then he's doing Tolkien. The influence is not the kind of influence that perhaps some structuralism and post-structuralism talks about. It's something much different, which also gives much more freedom, if you want, to the literary writer, where it comes from, which is amazing. Thank you very much. Question from Anton now.
Okay, I have a particular question. I hope it's interesting. Éowyn falls in love with two different characters in The Lord of the Rings. Aragorn first, and then Faramir. What is the meaning of this transition? What is the relation between this and the development of Éowyn characters?
Yeah, well, this is such a rich question, because again, Tolkien's giving us such a well-rounded character with Éowyn. Because in a sense, I don't actually think she falls in love twice. Not really. Because what she has for Aragorn, she's not really falling in love with Aragorn, the man. She's falling in love with an idea. And this is explicitly recognized later on. She has this image of him as the leader or the hero. And she's, I think, attaching herself to that with the idea that this hero character will somehow take her out of her negative setting where she's been, poisoned with this idea of her own worthlessness by Wormtongue. He's going to be the rescuer. He's going to be the knight in shining armor who sweeps her away and takes her off and makes her a queen. And that's the picture that she has sort of fixated on. So she doesn't really know Aragorn at all. She just is attached to the idea of Aragorn. And she's, if you think of it in sort of relational terms, she's really fortunate that Aragorn is such a good man, because she's setting herself up for exploitation, because somebody who was unscrupulous or manipulative could, really have messed with her. But Aragorn is a good man, and he pities her. He recognizes what is happening. He respects her. He admires her, and he doesn't allow her to attach herself to him, because he could have. And in a way, it would have made things easier. He could have given her what she seemed to want. Sure, come with us, and on our journey, and we'll do this together. And he doesn't. He sees it. He has the wisdom to know this is not a healthy attachment. This isn't right. Even apart from the fact that he's already, committed to Arwen, he has his own love and his own commitment he's being faithful to. But he doesn't even use that as an excuse with Éowyn. He doesn't bring Arwen into it. He just respects Éowyn as Éowyn, and it's just no. Respect you. I admire you. You have good work to do. No, you can't attach yourself to me. I'm going to go off and do my thing. You need to do what you've been given to do. So part of Éowyn's maturation as a character, as a woman, has to be the recognition that she'd made an idol, and she has to deal with that. And I think that is ultimately what happens in the Houses of Healing. She recognizes that no, she's not going to marry Aragorn. This is not her fairy tale ending, and she has to grieve that, which I think she does. And then she falls in love with Faramir, and this time it's actually Faramir whom she falls in love with. She gets to know him. They spend time together, and ultimately it's him as a person that she falls in love with, not the role. And she doesn't put on him any expectations of, you're going to carry me away, you're going to take me out of this setting. No, they're going to do their work together now. Whatever that might turn out to be. And so that ends up being an actual healthy relationship, a dynamic that allows her to go into this marriage as a real marriage and not as some sort of, wish fulfillment. So I think, again, we got a really rich depiction of her interior life. She has to, so many people, will do that. They attach onto, an image of something. I really want that. And they have to deal with the fact that it was the image, not the reality, and then come to grips with the reality. And I think we see that in Éowyn's arc.
Wonderful, Holly. Thank you very much. It was another wonderful, rich answer to a very interesting question. So at this point, we open the floor to the questions that Gilby has been collecting from the different channels. So I leave the floor to you, Gilby.
Okay, so the first one that I will read is from Matteo, that asks, it is a kind of worship in Aragorn, maybe. Good evening, Mrs. Ordway.
Yes, I think that's a great way of putting it. Because she shouldn't worship Aragorn. She's, in Tolkien would have been quite clear on that. There's the one true God, even though he's not mentioned in Lord of the Rings. He's there, and she's putting Aragorn in a place that is wrong for her, but also wrong for Aragorn, because he couldn't possibly live up to that role. Because as we've seen in the whole Lord of the Rings, Aragorn too is a human being. He has failings, he has flaws, he has indecision, and he could never have lived up to what Éowyn was expecting from him. So it was good for everybody that she ends up realizing that this isn't going to work.
The second question comes from Barbara that is asking in Italian, so I will translate live. So Éowyn is victim herself of Offermod, the excessive and fatal pride that plagues most male characters in Tolkien. I hope I said it right. Beppe, can you confirm? Okay.
Yeah, that's clear. So yeah, the offer mode is this kind of Anglo-Saxon concept of this excessive pride, and when it has an excessive pride, then one does stupid things. And of course, many male characters in The Lord of the Rings have this kind of pride. So the question is, do you think that also Éowyn has this kind of pride when she develops her arc throughout the story?
That's a great observation, and I would agree. Yeah, because, and again, I think this is just really neat how Tolkien confounds the easy sort of gender stereotypes, because this idea that the Offermod, the Anglo-Saxon sort of view of excessive pride, we mostly see it, you know, in the male characters, because, well, in Anglo-Saxon literature, most of the characters that we're seeing doing things are men, you know, out there having wars and slaying monsters and things. But it is in fact a fundamentally human failing, this excessive pride. And it happens to male characters in The Lord of the Rings. But lest us women become too complacent, he has it happen also to one of the female characters. So we women can't say, oh, we're always so humble. We no, she also suffers from it. Any of us can. And I think it's interesting to note, again, this is really tied in with Tolkien's theology. Pride and despair are aspects of the same thing. She despairs because she's been caught up in pride. She can't see a way forward other than the way that she sees one way forward, and if she can't have that, it must be nothing. It's the same kind of thing that Denethor is going through. But what we see in Éowyn is that she comes through it and out of it, whereas Denethor refuses to do that.
So now we'll take a bit of a liberty, Holly, and ask a question myself, because I cannot leave this conversation without asking a question, which for me is so important. And since you are an expert also of imagination, and that's a very important aspect of your research, a question that perhaps one of my burning questions is the following. You were saying before that the problem that Éowyn has with Aragorn is that she is attached to an image. She's attached to, if you want, a literary image to a certain extent, to a role, to something that comes also, if you want, from her readings, not real readings, but from the kind of work of imagination that she has been doing alone in the house. But on the other hand, we are here all together, and the two of us, but all the other, and who are almost devoting the life to the role of imagination as something which is very positive and very useful. How do we find a compromise between the two? These two things seem in contradiction. On the one hand, imagination brings you astray, because instead of making you look at Faramir, it makes you look at Aragorn. On the other hand, of course, imagination is something very positive in Aragorn. In Tolkien. What's your idea? Is there a good imagination, a bad imagination? Is there a good way to use imagination and a bad way to use imagination? What do you think?
Well, I would say that we have to rethink what we mean by imagination, because imagination, I would argue in my work, it's a human faculty. It's like the reason, it's like the emotions, it's like the will. And so we all have it as a function. And it's neutral in itself, the same way that emotions are neutral in themselves. But we can react well or we can react badly, or even with our reason. We can draw wrong conclusions, we can draw right conclusions, depending on all sorts of factors. So I think the imagination is again, this capacity Tolkien calls the mental capacity for image making. How do we use it? And we can use it well or we can use it badly. And I think in the examples that you give, I hope that we are using it well. I think Tolkien is using it well overall in his storytelling to help us conceive of and reflect on things that bring us closer to truth, that move us, that show us real beauty. And then within the story, I think he's giving us a couple of examples of how the imagination can go astray. I think we have Éowyn, in her room by herself, brooding over what Wormtongue has told her, and then fixating on Aragorn as her imagined sort of way out. And that would be a kind of faulty application. She's looking for the good. She's trying to find the good and focus on it, but her imagination has been sort of starved. She hasn't had it nourished properly. She doesn't know what to look for. So then when she sees Aragorn, boom, she just sort of attaches onto him as that's going to be the figure who's going to save me. So I think with Éowyn, Tolkien is kind of evoking the danger of a imagination that has been sort of starved, undernourished. So it grabs onto something that in potential is good. I mean, Aragorn is going to be a good husband to Arwen. Not to Éowyn, but he's going to be a good husband. It isn't like she was totally off. Just it wasn't the right connection for her, and it was for the wrong reasons. But then to go over again to Denethor, who we keep running into, that's another way I think that Tolkien shows the dangers of the imagination, because there, Denethor's got a very vivid imagination. He's very vividly seeing what could happen, with the attack of Sauron, neutral in itself. He could use that to be motivated to defend Gondor. But he ends up going into despair, largely because he's been fed false, misleading ideas from Sauron himself through the Palantir. So here you have Denethor, who's the victim of a kind of corrupted imagination. He's been feeding on things that lead him in the wrong direction. So his imagination isn't starved. It's overfed with dangerous, toxic images, and that's what causes him to go wrong. So I think the imagination, I think we see in Tolkien, is very powerful, but he's by no means naive that the imagination is always going to lead to good. So he gives us these pictures to show, yeah, it can go wrong. So we need to nourish it properly, and we need to make sure that what we're nourishing it with is true and not false.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you're waiting for me. We have another question from YouTube, made from Eduardo, that asks, how important is the maturation process in Éowyn? Let's not forget that she is very young in the books, and Faramir is one of the wisest characters, so he can help her.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent observation, because she does mature. She's not a set piece character who is complete in herself and doesn't change. We see her young and we see her maturing, and I think we get a glimpse that she's going to, really grow into a mature woman, a real leader of her people. So I think that the very fact that we do see a maturation process is important. We see that, yeah, just because someone's young and making maybe some foolish and hasty decisions, they're not stuck there. They can grow, and especially they can grow and mature with other people's help. And I think that, again, is why, as Eduardo points out, that Faramir is so important, because we don't, we're meant to be in community. And so we have all sorts of community. We got the fellowship, obviously, but yeah, look at the houses of healing. Éowyn is coming to herself. She's maturing. She's healing in a little community amongst people who love her, who are going to guide her, with Faramir there, who again has fallen in love with her and has the wisdom and will guide her. And let's not forget too that although we don't really see it happening because the story ends, but I think Éowyn is going to help Faramir to heal, because he's been pretty thoroughly rejected by his father. His father tried to murder him. I think this is going to take some healing too. And so we have, I think, one of the great, beautiful things about that pairing is that they're both of them wounded, and they're both going to help each other to peace and healing. And that, again, shows us that maturation process again.
I have a question, if listen me, okay. What is the role of Éowyn as regards from unification between Gondor and Rohan?
Well, I mean, I think she's going to be a unifying figure in that, she's providing a link in marriage between the houses of Rohan and the houses of Gondor. And I think, Tolkien obviously would have been very well aware of, the fact that in medieval history, there were lots of marriages that were arranged in that way so that it would bring about peace. So in that sense, it's kind of, echoing medieval European history, but he's making sure that we're seeing that this is a match that's voluntary, that's a love match, that she hasn't just been given as a pawn to make a stronger alliance with Gondor, that there's going to be a stronger alliance with Gondor, I would imagine, because of that relationship, but all the stronger because it's built on genuine love and respect, rather than just like, okay, well, here we're gonna connect the dots. So I would just say that in a way this might be kind of Tolkien suggesting, at least by implication, that we're going to have healthier societies if we're respecting each other kind of from the ground up. I have a sense that in the history of Middle Earth, it's likelier that this is going to go well, precisely because Éowyn and Faramir are voluntarily getting married out of love rather than just a political alliance.
Go on, Anton. Otherwise, I go.
Can I go? Okay, I have one question, but it's external of this type of argument, but is near. How is the appreciation of the young Americans for this type of literature, for the fantasy, and in particular of the fantasy with medieval inspiration?
Well, I think there's a huge appetite for it. I think it's continued it's continued to grow. I mean, it seems like everybody loves Tolkien. Well, not everybody, sadly, but there is I think an ongoing appetite, ongoing enthusiasm in America for Tolkien's work, and for works that draw on the same general sort of atmosphere and material. But this is an interesting point that I'm going to just sort of take it in a totally different direction. I think most readers of fantasy have thought that what made the Lord of the Rings special was its sort of medieval flavor. So if you look at all the things that have come out after Tolkien, like almost all of the copycat works are set in sort of pseudo medieval settings. And it gets really kind of derivative, and they're not as powerful. So you have this sort of this sense of people going back to what they think are the sources, but they're not getting anywhere with it. And I think, and this is partly what a conclusion I came to after writing Tolkien's modern reading. I think in some ways we've kind of mistaken the source of the power of the Lord of the Rings, because sure, it has medieval elements, it has that flavor. Of course it does. He was a medievalist. He's drawing on that. But the fact that it has, elves and dwarves and wizards and, kind of pre-modern Anglo-Saxon kind of figures in it. Yeah, that's what he chose to use. But the source of his power is in the themes, in the material, in the characterization, in his writing, which is so powerful, in all sorts of other things that I think are rooted in his understanding of the modern world. I think he's much more fully rooted in the modern world than anybody has really reckoned with until now. He wasn't rejecting it wholesale, not at all. And I think that's why you can get that. That's, I think, a key element of why the Lord of the Rings continues to be so powerful. Because, like, why would a book that was published, excuse me, why would a book that was published in the 1950s, set in some fantasy medieval land, continue to be relevant for Americans, in 2020 and beyond? Like, it can't just be nostalgia. That's not enough to account for the power of it, the ongoing power of it. And I think it's precisely that it's not fundamentally nostalgic. It's not fundamentally backward looking. It's rooted in his modern day and responding to it. And he's drawing on a lot of the themes of modern culture of modern issues, you know, the rise of the machine and what that meant, the question of power. I mean, I think we're so used to the idea that the quest is to get rid of the ring that we forget how absolutely that's a reversal of all sorts of medieval stories. In medieval literature, you don't throw away the ring of power, you go find it. You find it and you use it, you bring it home, you recover the treasure. So the fact that his fellowship is trying to get rid of the ring of power is something I think he could only write by his engagement with the 20th century. So I think that is really at the heart of why he continues to be so popular. And until I think other writers come to grips with that, we're not going to see other fantasy stories that are as powerful, because we can't just copy the surface stuff and hope to get the same results, because what makes Tolkien great is what goes all the way down deep, not just the surface expression.
Thank you.
Another question from Matteo. Speaking of pop culture, do you think that Peter Jackson's movies portrayed and displayed Éowyn at her best?
I don't know. I liked the movies. I will say that. I thought they were well done. I thought he did a pretty good job with depicting Éowyn, but I don't think he manages to get the richness of the character as we see it in the book. I think it's a little bit more the sort of flat, like, female hero kind of character. I think some of her complexity gets a little bit flattened out. Like, I don't think we see her arc the way that we do in the book. So I think it was okay. It was fine. But I think that it doesn't quite do justice to what Tolkien actually does with the character, which in the book is richer and fuller and has more of an interior life, I think, which I admit is hard to capture in a film. So maybe I'm asking too much. But I think Éowyn's in the book has a much richer psychological, emotional, interior life than we get in the films.
So we have 3 minutes left, and if you don't mind, I would like to conclude with a few words and also with a very, very short final question. And if you noticed, the word that one of the words that Holly used the most is the word complexity. One of the problems with Tolkien's reception, as she pointed out very clearly, so let me again strongly recommend to buy her book. You can find, if you Google it, Tolkien Modern Readings, you will find it online. It's available for pre-ordering, so let me do a bit of marketing. But she gave us a taste of what she has been doing and so on, to go beyond this kind of medieval reception of Tolkien. And now I come to the question. And to a certain extent, Éowyn and Rohan, if there is something medieval in Tolkien, it's really Rohan. I mean, that's something that we know also from the language, because the language of Rohan is basically Anglo-Saxon. So if we call this Middle Ages, let's say early Middle Ages. In many respects, Éowyn has also been emerging tonight. In some respects, she is a medieval character to a certain extent. So I would like to conclude this session tonight by asking you, what do you think, apart from, we already said that Tolkien enhanced the role of Éowyn and that she's much more complex. But at the same time, I would like to ask you to go a bit deeper on this and ask you basically this. What do you think is the most important addition of Tolkien to Éowyn as a medieval character, as regards especially her personality? If we have to come out with a kind of Christian understanding of the woman, or we can also say a modern understanding of the woman, combination of the two, where do you think we can really see that in the characterization of Éowyn? If so, or Éowyn, in many respects, does remain a medieval character, because certainly she starts from being a medieval to a certain extent, but she does not end with medieval. Can you just very briefly tell us what you think is the most important addition, the most important transformation? I really like the word you used tonight.
Yeah, I think, and again, what Tolkien's doing is he really integrates the medieval and the modern. The medieval is so important. It's such an important piece. So we don't want to leave that aside. But he doesn't just take it and import it in. I mean, in a way, that's what Morris does. Morris just tries to recreate the medieval, but Tolkien doesn't. And I would suggest to your question that what the most important addition is that he gives her fundamentally an interior life, that she has an arc of emotional and psychological transformation, of maturation. She has conflict, and that conflict is internal. It's not external. It's emotional. It's moral. And that we can really take that for granted, but that is something that came about in literature primarily with the advent of the novel. It is not fundamentally a characteristic of medieval literature. Now, I love medieval literature. It's wonderful, but it has its own characteristics. And having characters with rich, complex interior lives is not one of the characteristics of medieval literature. It just isn't. And so I think what we see in Éowyn is the medieval components being drawn in, and he's bringing in a very modern novelistic sensibility about character and the presentation of character. And it has become we're so used to that we don't see how absolutely sort of surprising it is that he would meld the two and give us this sort of medieval inspired setting, but with characters that have rich interior lives and interior conflicts and emotional strain, and that they change over the course of the story. That is a huge addition to Éowyn that I would say that Tolkien does.
Wonderful. So it's now 10 o'clock, so 10 to 1, so we'll now stop now. Let me thank you very much, really, Holly, for this wonderful conversation we had tonight, honestly.
It was my pleasure.
It was amazing. One of the aims of our journey together is to make step forward. I mean, tonight we have jumped a lot. Thank you. Honestly, really, it's been amazing. We discovered this combination between the modern, the medieval, the complexity, and also what you said just now about the way Tolkien, in a way, integrates the contribution of the novel into a certain extent of novelistic literature. Everything for Tolkien can be used for something greater, and that's basically one of the aims of our journey together. All the different pieces of the mosaic at the end can be added into a beautiful unifying image. Thank you very much, Holly. It will be a pleasure, hopefully, meeting you in Italy next August, when we all hope all the present chaos will be over. But as we know also from Tolkien, there is beauty, there is growing beauty, even in the middle of the storm, even in the middle of the shadows. And I think what we have done tonight, it's a very clear confirmation and witness to this. Thank you very much, Holly. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
No audio.
Oh, sorry, I was mute. So thank you, everybody, everyone who listened to this show this evening. You were very, very much. Yes, no. You were a lot, and we were very, very glad you joined us tonight. Next time we will see each other in the 2021 on the 7th of January with Hamish Williams from the Netherlands, and we will talk about Mary. So again, thank you so much. Thank you, Holly, for being here tonight with us, and obviously thank you, Beppe, for the opportunity of this cooperation between us and the Tree of Tales. Thank you so much. Thank you, Beppe. He's gone. Okay.
Have a good night.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.